Hey everybody, Jeff Hamilton here, lead pastor of Hills Church, and this is our fourth week in the Epic series in these small 7-week process of these life groups where we're taking a little deeper dig into some of these Old Testament stories. In fact, these stories are great. The plot lines and the characters are phenomenal. We've wrapped up the first 5 books of the Bible. Last week we touched on Joshua and this transition as people began to possess the promise that God has for them, and stepped last week, this past Sunday, into the period of the Judges by taking a look at the life of Gideon. You know, one of the things we come to realize when we see God's people starting to move into God's promise is that the promise doesn't always look the way that you think that it's going to look. In fact, nobody thinks that once you begin to try to possess God's promise for your life, it's going to be a continual fight. From the period of Joshua all the way through the Judges, even into the kingdom until it is ultimately divided, that God's people are always at war trying to either possess or hold on to what God's promise is. You ever notice that whenever there's not conflict, that's when people start to complain. That's when you start to worship other things. And that's when the attack begins again. And then you start that process of just trying to survive. And that's kind of where we find Gideon, isn't it? That we are doing all the right things, but nothing seems to be working. You know, God comes to visit Gideon, and he first encounters him threshing wheat in this wine press. You know, that can't be a very effective way to do it. It makes everything so hard. But God finds us in those places where we're just hiding, where it seems that we're just fighting for survival. And he calls us out. He invites us to join him in the process of what he's wanting to do that involves something so much bigger than just even our own life. I don't know about you, but I've discovered in my life, and very similar to what we studied about with Gideon, that God's plan doesn't always line up with what I think needs to be happen. In fact, God's plan often involves less resources. In the story of Gideon, he starts out with 32,000 warriors, and he ends up going to war with only 300 of them. God doesn't seem to give you the equipment that you need. Instead of swords and shields and chariots, he equips Gideon's army with lanterns and a torch and a pitcher and a trumpet of all things. It doesn't seem to make any sense, but it's always because we don't understand all the way in which God is working. In fact, what we see through Gideon and that story is that ultimately Gideon's army wins the battle without ever having to actually engage in the fight. When the story comes back to Joshua and now again to Gideon, we find this recurring theme that God is with you. That God is always with you. And God is always for you. But what we find in the story of Gideon is that he's going to find you. And most of the time, we're not waiting on God like we think we are. He's waiting on us. He's waiting on us to join him in the thing that he is wanting to do that we think is impossible. The very thing that is causing us to hide is the very thing that he wants to use us to bring freedom into other people's lives. Hope you have a great time in this discussion tonight in these groups. Please be sure to thank your hosts and your facilitators in this group. Again, it's better to make this a couple times during this 8-week process than it is just to not participate at all, because the relationships that are being formed is something that God will use as we all work together and fight together to possess the promise that God has for us. Thanks.